What's up, everyone? This is the maiden episode of the Unscripted Success podcast. My name is Braxton Wood. Before we get into the meat of this first episode, I want to explain who I am and what the inspiration of this podcast is. Then I'll share the unique format of the show and we'll dive right into questions. So I am the founder of an executive career consulting company, and I help high performers find and land their ideal careers. I've worked with VIP clients from Hollywood and companies such as Reddit, Coinbase, Variety Magazine, and NBC News. And the inspiration for what I do, and in turn for this podcast, stems from me having no formal education at all. In fact, I didn't even graduate high school, much less attend college. And that experience of having to navigate my career path without having any school to lean on whatsoever, it has showed me that there's a much better approach to career development than the traditional philosophy that we've heard from our previous generations, where they say, go to school so you can get a good job. And my method is so effective and it works so well that it almost works without fail. There's no other way I can say it. Now, as far as the podcast goes, every week on this podcast will feature a different guest. And my requirement for them is that in some way, they have to have taken the road less traveled in their career, and they have to be making at least six figures. Now, when they join me, we will be taking questions on the topics of career and business and giving our hot take on them. And then we'll have a discussion around those topics. And you, as our listeners, are invited to contribute and participate in the show because the questions we will be answering are submitted by you. And the goal with this show is to empower those of you within the professional community to take command of your career and land your dream job on your own terms. So be sure to check the show notes after listening if you would like to submit a question that you can hear on the show yourself. And with that, let's dive into some of our questions today. Now, normally, as I mentioned before, this is just the maiden episode. And so you can expect to have really exciting guests in future episodes. And we've already got a pretty incredible lineup. And I know you guys are going to enjoy some of the stories that our guests have to share as a result of answering your questions. So just to get started, since I'm by myself today, here's the first question. The person submitted this question saying, my employee refuses to do her job, and it leads me in circles about why she won't. And then this leader continues on by saying, I'm dealing with a challenging situation involving a direct report. They excel in tasks within their preferred domain, but resist any work outside of it. This has led to underperformance issues and a significant amount of time being spent on managing her compared to other team members. Despite setting specific performance goals and consulting with my own manager, I'm at a crossroads on how to proceed. Our communication has been problematic for years, and she often compares my management style unfavorably to her previous manager. Given that she does possess valuable technical expertise and that the termination process would be both exhaustive and fraught with complications, how can I effectively address this underperformance and resistance to diversifying her tasks? Is there a way to turn things around without resorting to a formal performance improvement plan or termination? Okay, so to answer the question here, to give my hot take, it sounds like there might be a couple of issues at play here. One is, and I hate to say it, but I'm in the camp of if something's going wrong, then leadership is ultimately accountable for it. So I don't know who hired this individual, if it was you or a superior, but someone missed something in the hiring process. And I would argue, based on what I experience as a career consultant and based on what I hear in terms of feedback and experiences from my recruiter partners, what I find is most employers don't spend enough time in the hiring process when they determine who they're going to hire. And so I would invite you first, my first answer to this question, it doesn't help you in this situation now, but for future hires, I would invite you to be more intentional with your hiring process, because there's a chance that maybe it's not robust enough, or you're not doing enough due diligence to really vet this person out. So now going on to this specific individual particularly, I think there might be a couple things in play on why they feel apprehensive about taking on work that is outside of their comfort zone. It might be because of a previous experience with another company in a different job where uh, perhaps the manager was super critical of them. And so they feel very almost anxious to step out of that comfort zone for fear that history is going to repeat itself and that she's conditioned to basically take on negative feedback in a way that is not productive and not helpful for her. So maybe she's afraid of getting you getting harsh with her, in other words. Another thing that might be happening is, this goes with maybe if she's not a good hire, then maybe she is trying to just coast through her job, which I've seen some people do as well. I remember working at a particular company where I was working alongside in the same department with someone that was hired at the same time I was. He wasn't going to put any more effort into than what the job description required. And he was just going to sit back and let the company struggle with certain things that the company was struggling with at the time and not intervene because it wasn't part of his job description. And he even made the comment that he didn't use these terms, but he basically said that he was happy to kiss bosses' butts in order to maintain that position for himself. So all that is to say, perhaps this individual is thinking something similar. And I'm in leadership. One of the most important things about leadership is to always assume positive intent and always seek to understand, right? Now, you've tried to do the seeking to understand part based on reading your question, where you've gone, it sounds like you've had very circular conversations with this person where they push back and then you change the subject and try and explain that you help them. And then they change the subject and it sounds like it's turning into a circular conversation with them because of you trying to manage this person more. That's the vibe I'm getting. So this might be a case where it's almost like a self-preservation tactic where as long as they stay in their wheelhouse, they feel like they should be good performers because, and then in doing so, it'll reflect well on them. And what they're not realizing is not reflecting well on them because there's other elements of their job and what is required for them in their job that is not working because they're resistant to it. And that's something going back to a leadership thing. One of the biggest things I'm a fan of is something called 360-degree feedback. And so if you're not familiar with this leadership approach, it basically means you have dedicated time in a dedicated space where you and your team member, your subordinate, whoever, can have an open dialogue about their performance, right? And part of this, where this works really well, is if you make sure that there are also clear expectations about what this person's job is and what metrics or what KPIs they're being expected to uphold. So when I worked at a tech company, this was called our big three. We basically had three metrics. Everyone in the company, even the CEO, from top to bottom, everyone had a big three. And those big three were very specific metrics that their performance was measured against. So for someone in sales, it might have been, dial 200 numbers a day or make 200 phone calls in a day. And then the second one might have been hit a certain number in commissions or hit a certain number of sales or deals or something like that. The examples like that, that's what your big three is. And so I would invite you to consider the possibility that maybe this person signed up for this job not having clarity on what the expectations and requirements for the job is. And if that wasn't communicated to them, again, I hate to say it, but that's a failure on the leadership part. So those are some things to consider. Lastly, just to kind of close on this question, what else do you do to deal with them? It sounds like you're trying to avoid a performance plan. And so the way that I think you would avoid it is to first make sure that their metrics or whatever expectations they're being held to are crystal clear and documented. And if they're not, then that's the first step. You need to tell this individual that this is what they're expected to. This is part of the job. It always has been. And a failure to meet those expectations, those requirements is then what will result in a performance plan or possible termination. That's the way I look at it. Great question. All right, let's go on to the second question. This one says, I'm required to commute to the office each day to do remote work. Well, let's see what this is about. So this person says, I was initially hired for a leadership position that was branded as remote, but last minute changes have prompted my superior, who is the COO, to require me to work in the office in person. Despite being in the office, literally all of our meetings are conducted via Zoom, even though all team members are in the office and even in the same hallway. Okay, wait. I'm sorry. That does sound. Oh, they even say this feels like a Saturday Night Live skit. I would agree. This is ridiculous. This is already sounding ridiculous. Okay, so they go on and they say, not to mention this office lacks essential equipment like printers and scanners, and it makes my job less efficient than what my home setup is. Additionally, my office is situated right next to the COO's office, who comes in daily and seems to prefer having me in the office for social reasons, and I suspect also to check up on me. Lastly, I'll mention that other people in the company are actually permitted to work from home, no problem. I'm just suddenly not one of them. Given these circumstances, is there a feasible way to negotiate more remote days without jeopardizing my position, or should I continue my search for a new job? Is it realistic to expect a change in the current in-office requirement, especially considering the COO's preference for in-person interactions? Okay, so I've lived this before, not specifically about remote work. Actually, it was remote work, but there were some other requirements I had for a job where the job was misrepresented to me, and then none of the things promised to me in taking that job were ever provided, and I ended up quitting over it. So remote work was one of them. There are a few others, but um, the first thing I would say is, like, so much of navigating your career, I feel like you have to have an entrepreneurial kind of spirit to it. And what I mean by that is be extremely, like, excruciatingly clear about everything up front. So the first question I would ask about this is, well, when you took this job, is it documented? Is it on black and white on paper that this job would be remote? Because if it was, then that gives you some leverage to, make a case for yourself. If it wasn't, and it was just basically told to you that it's remote and there was no other commitment or documented proof that this job was going to be remote, then you don't have as much leverage. First thing to keep in mind is always get those types of things in writing. I made the mistake, and had I done that, I probably would have been able to sue my employer over it, but I didn't take those steps and do that due diligence, and so it wasn't possible for me. So that's the first thing, is to always preempt all sorts of situations that will end up being unpleasant like that. A lot of this depends on your rapport with your superior. And I think you said it was the COO. So that's kind of an impactful role in the company where you obviously don't want to step on any toes. And so much of this comes down to, like, the culture of your company, what their core values are. And also kind of going back to the previous question where I talked about 360-degree feedback. Do you have an environment at this company that is like that? Because if you do, and they honor it and with integrity, then I think that's something you should raise. I think that's a fair question to raise in that environment. But my guess is that's not the case for you. Most companies don't truly end up being that way, based on my experience and that of my clients even. So what I would say is, any type of negotiation is all about leverage, and it's in business, it's in your career, it's in, sometimes it's even in relationships, right? I don't think you're out of line for asking a genuine question. The problem is will your supervisor take it that way? And so you got to do as much as you can to have leverage kind of supporting the question. And hopefully your supervisor will take it for what it is and take it for the way it's intended. So in terms of how you do that, what I often recommend to clients trying to navigate situations like this is, first, you have your leverage, but also it's easier to present our supervisors, our superiors, with a solution to the problem instead of just complaining about it, because that's the way they're going to see it. You just go and say, hey, this isn't fair, blah, 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 without a solution proposed to them, then they're just going to feel like you're complaining, and you don't want that. So the way I would do this, and the way I've advised previous clients to do it, is to come up with milestones, or basically package up a solution that contains multiple milestones, so it's easier for them to swallow and digest. And what I mean by that is, maybe you don't work from home all the time like you're wanting to, even though it was already promised to you. Maybe you ask them if you can work remotely 1 day a week, since, and that's like almost a compromise, right? And so that's just the first milestone. And you, in terms of a proposal, you tell your supervisor, if that works out, would you consider, and I'm more productive and I'm efficient, would you consider me allowing me to work 2 days from home or something like that, whatever you're comfortable with. But the whole point is instead of saying, this isn't fair, you told me I could work from home, it's not fair that you changed it, let me work from home, right? That's just complaining. Present a solution where you, in a proposal where you say, hey, I took this job anticipating being able to work from home because that was what was initially promised to me. I see other people working from home, and I also see that we're all having our meetings virtually, even though we're in the same building anyway. So without all that in mind, would you allow me to take 1 day a week? You can pick any day you want, and that will be my remote work day, and see what they say. Or if you want to, kind of layer it again, you could say something like, in addition to that, if I increase my productivity, if my productivity doesn't slip because of it, would you consider allowing 2 days after that? And so on, whatever you're comfortable with. But the whole point is to package up your solution and present it to your supervisor in a way where it's easy for them to digest. So that's what I would do in that situation. And just so you guys know, I kind of gave, I had a client where I suggested this for them. What their issue was about their compensation. So they had been at the company for something like 10 years. This was a very niche industry too, where it's not, you're not going to find people lining up in this job just because of how specific the skill and the science was in this case. So what had happened was this guy's company, there was someone that had been there for a very long time. He was like, like a I almost envisioned the way he described this guy was like just someone that was an expert in the field, almost like, like a like Yoda or Mr. Miyagi, like just an old wise soul that had the job down perfect sitting in this company. So that man eventually retired, and my client, who I provided the advice to, took on all of his work, but he didn't get an increase in pay, a title, nothing. He just took over the guy's work that retired. And he was frustrated by it because he felt like he was deserved more, which he did. I think that's fair. So what I helped him package up to his employer was a milestone of compensation. So basically what he proposed to his employer was, over the course of 6 months, actually it was a year, he had 3 milestones. And so if he performed well, if his output and his productivity was really good, then let's bump up my pay X amount after the first quarter, and then rinse and repeat for Q3, Q4, and so on. And that's what he did. And his employer totally went for it because his employer saw the value. This guy had leverage because he was the only person in the company that could do what the previous guy that retired could do. And so it was a win-win. So Q1 came around, no mistakes. His productivity is really good. His output was really good. So he got a pay bump. And so now I think, as a result of that, a year's gone by, and I think he doubled his pay doing that. So just something to keep in mind there. All right, let's go on to the next question. This question says, I asked for my old job back. And it says, after leaving my previous job for a higher paying, fully remote position with great benefits, I've realized within a month that remote work doesn't suit me personally due to the lack of office camaraderie. I've professionally reached out to my former employer, offering a long-term commitment and flexibility in roles, to ask for my old job back. What should I expect in this situation? I've lived this as well. So what happened was, for me, I was in a job I didn't like. This was during the last recession of 2008, basically. And I was in a job that I didn't like. I was in that job for quite a few years because it was the only thing I could find at the time. This is quite a while ago. And when I finally found another position that was better, I took that job without hesitation. Then I had someone that I had applied to months earlier reach out to me, and it was even a better opportunity than the new job I just took. So I quit that job after only working there like a month. I moved to another state. I worked this job for 18 months and then just finally decided and realized that this job wasn't for me that I took. So I went back to the job that I only worked a month at, basically applying again. I went to the same manager, everything. And while the manager themselves probably would have taken me back, their supervisor didn't know me. And so it was an easy no for the supervisor because all they saw was someone that jumped ship after a month and then now is wanting back, right? And so how do they know that I wouldn't do that again? That's my response to this question as well. The very first thing that your employer is going to think if you ask for your old job is how much longer are we going to have them around for this time, for this go around? And some companies, like I've seen it, where plenty of companies have taken former employees back because there's a great need or because of their very specific skill set or something like that. It can depend. But if you didn't talk about what the response from your employer was, so I don't have that information. But even I myself as an employer, if I had a former employee that had left, then the thought's going to cross my mind about why are they, like, how long am I going to have them if they're committing to me? The other thing that you mentioned here in the question is that you promised a long-term commitment to your former employer. That's all well and good. But then there's the whole legal element to a lot of this. And so, like, it depends. If your employer were to consider taking you back, then I wouldn't be surprised if they wanted to add additional stipulations in your employment contract this go around. And so maybe it is like that there's a 3-year probationary period or something like that. And if you leave within that time, then there's some sort of penalty or something like that. Maybe, like, I don't know, maybe you don't get your last commission check or your last paycheck. I don't know. So those things aren't legal, and that's a bad example, but I'm just throwing that out as an example. That's the thing I would think about. And so in terms of what you can expect, I think you should expect that it's not going to be an easy road to convince your former employer to take you back. The other thing to think about is, like, there's the whole at will laws, and at least I forget what the number is, but at least like half the states in the country are at will employment, which means there's no recourse, there's no repercussions for you quitting or for them firing you. So that's something to consider as well. If there's no recourse for you legally to quit, then your employer, like, that's something they have to consider, and they might not want to take that risk a second time with you. Another thing to keep in mind is some employers, what they look at is what were the conditions or the circumstances around you leaving the first time around. And so, for example, when I left the company that I didn't like, where I was working during the recession, and I left it for the company that I ended up only working for a month, when I was at that company, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. And so I initially did provide my 2 weeks, but the nature of that job, they weren't really going to miss me if I had left sooner. And so imagine me sitting there, not ever loving that job. In fact, quite hating it. There was never a time where I loved that job. It was just a job for me at the time. So imagine sitting there, being somewhere you have never wanted to be, and you like, in the back of your mind, you already have an out. It's really hard to ignore when that's the situation. And so even though I had initially provided my 2 weeks notice, one day I just had enough, and I was probably maybe a week into my 2 weeks notice. And I went to my boss and I said, look, I need to go and prepare for my new job and blah, 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 which was partially true, but I just wanted to get out of there. And so I said, I'm sorry, but I'm going to leave today. So my boss just said, okay, fine, if you're going to leave now, but just know that that'll make you non-hireable if you ever come back to us again. And I had hated that job always. And so that was an easy thing to say yes to. So packed up and I left just like that. And it was really funny to watch all my coworkers watch me as I was doing that. But so that's something to keep in mind too, is that if it's an at-will state, then your employer has to consider that being a possibility too, because a 2 weeks notice, some people think that that's a legal thing in this country. I don't know why some people think that, but that's just a tradition with the American job market. There's no law or requirement or anything about 2 weeks beyond what your employer might ask of you. So that's what I have to say about that. Might not directly answer your question, but those are the things to consider about what's at play when you're trying to get your old job back. All right. And then we have just one more question I'm going to leave on the show for today. This person asks, how do I command the respect that my position deserves? They say, I'm a female in my 30s where I have a lateral leadership role. My problem is that I'm kind, friendly, and understanding, and some of the other engineers don't respect me, try to push their work on me, and so on. I work with executives at our client companies, and often they assume I'm a junior person, presumably because I look young and possibly because I'm female. After a few interactions, however, they often say I'm the best account executive they ever had. How could I improve my presence and better manage unconscious bias? Like there's a lot of variables at play here. And also you're asking the person that was, I was a homeschool kid and I didn't go to high school. And so imagine the, the, the unaware bias that people may have about me. I think to some extent though, and my point with that is that in some way, shape or form, I think we all have that. We all have to deal with it in one way or another just because no one's perfect and we all have different personalities. And so when you interact with dozens or hundreds of people at your job, there's always going to be someone that has the exact wrong impression of you, right? So let's just preface my answer by saying that. I think the way, if I think about like, okay, if I look back on my career and like, how did I navigate my career as the formerly quiet, shy homeschool kid, right? That grew up into an adult that needed to, have a professional life to be able to support himself and his family, right? How did that happen? So when I think about what happened to me is you let your work and your achievements do the talking. And it can be tricky because the way you do that is different with how you interact with clients versus how you interact with supervisors and other people, your peers at your company. And in fact, it might be easier to do at your company because after you're there long enough and you have a strong track record with your performance, everyone's going to know that one way or another. With clients, it can be trickier. And so I think the way that you do that, the way that I navigated this was I found opportunities to talk about and reference big accomplishments that I've had with other clients. After you do that enough, you build up this authority clout for yourself in the eyes of the people you're interacting with. So all that is to say is part of this is a process. No one's going to assume that you're a champion until you give them a reason to. And so perhaps just because of your young age, and I don't know what your tenure is at this company, you just have to give yourself some time and go through the process, the dues paying process of establishing yourself as an authority. And I think people will come around. Eventually, if you're assuming your company has a good culture, then you may even get recognition or promotion as a result of your performance. And that will speak for itself as well. When you go from being, it sound like you're an account executive and you go to being something like, a manager, director, or VP, people are going to treat you differently. And while in this scenario, that's what you're looking for, there's some cons to it as well, I guess. So I'm in thinking about this. The company that I worked at during the recession that I was talking about in my previous, in the previous question, there's a woman there, wonderful person. She was my grand boss, basically. So not my supervisor, but my supervisor's supervisor, and wonderful person. And very like wonderful and nice, just kind and compassionate. And which is something that I think we tend to stereotype leadership into being, kind of brazen or unapproachable or intimidating, right? This woman was none of those things. And so that was how she commanded respect, not by demanding it, but by showing people that she wasn't a threat and that she cared. Being in the position that you're in, if it's within kind of your natural personality to do that, that's something that I would suggest doing, is show people that not only that you have chops, but show them that you care. And it's a lot harder to be critical of someone or to mistreat them when they show interest in you. I hope that makes sense. So that is the maiden episode of the Unscripted Success podcast. And again, my name is Braxton Wood. If you find this episode helpful, if you've liked the content, if you've liked the discussion that I've kind of had here, even though I've had it with myself today, do me a favor, subscribe to the podcast. And again, hit the show notes and submit a question that you would like to hear on the show. And the next time around, I'm going to have a guest on the show that will field the question with me, and we'll both give our hot take on it. We'll both have a discussion around it. So I look forward to having you guys and sharing future episodes with you, sharing future questions with you, sharing future content with you. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you on the next episode.